The bottom line for us, for our party, is that reparations on a global basis can only be permanently won by replacing the capitalist system. A system built on the backs of slavery, genocidal theft of indigenous lands, and wage slavery worldwide, with a socialist society where those who have had suffered the most do if they belong to an oppressed nation will be repaid with free quality health care, housing, education, food, jobs, guaranteed legal and social protection from racism and other forms of inequality like patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, and much more. Well, Marxism, first and foremost, teaches us to look at the world, how to examine the world the way it is, especially from a class point of view. Do you belong to the ruling class or are you a member of the working class? And that can be very, very broad. And of course, the majority of the world are workers, including oppressed people. I mean, we are the vast majority of the world, but the vast majority of the world owns nothing, in terms of wealth. You have like 80 families who own like 3/4 of the world's wealth. And that's been documented, So just starting from there, and a nation in general means, belonging to a group of people usually who live in the same geographical area, who socialize or whatever. That's generally what a nation is. It's sort of the close proximity of where people live. But when you're talking about Black people or Latinx people or Palestinian people, it's really, you talk about a nation within a nation. In terms of symbol, I would say, again, and they are connected, the symbolism and the materialism are connected. Because if you're calling for taking down a Confederate statue, this is a psychological, and when it happens, it's a psychological victory that could lead to other important demands through the movement and through the struggle. What about replacing that statue with a statue of Malcolm X or Harriet Tubman or, someone like that? That's really, really intangibles, demands that are connected to each other. Another symbolic demand is freeing of Mia. Freeing of Mia. That's a very important, symbolic demand, because what it will lead to is, what about the freedom of other political prisoners? Let's see, other demands. Well, anyway, those are just a few, thoughts about that. Because everything is about the struggle. Everything is about how do we move the struggle forward in terms of the liberation of not only Black people, but oppressed people around the world, for working people. And I just want to say this too about this being a working class demand, reparations. Where we differ from what Randall Robinson, for instance, said in that quote I read when he was talking about white society, owes Black people, for reparations. We differentiate between white workers and the ruling class. It's really the ruling class wouldn't be the ruling class if it wasn't for slavery. The ruling class would not be the ruling class if it wasn't for the 2/3 theft of Mexico. Hello. It would not be the ruling class if it wasn't theft for indigenous lands. This is how capitalism was built in this country and, of course, around the world. The super exploitation of oppressed people around the world. This was all about building a system that cares more about profits than people. So it's the ruling class that owes, oppressed people reparations. It's the ruling class. Now, it's the role of white workers to support the call for reparations, to show that solidarity. Because it's true, white workers have been given more crumbs, so to speak, higher wages and so forth, because of, this super exploitation. The ruling class does everything it can to divide and conquer, and especially to divide the white workers, who I mentioned before, were given a few more crumbs in terms of, privilege, whether that was, higher wages, better benefits, a little bit more better housing, etc., against the most oppressed. And of course, the most oppressed, were blamed for everything. If you couldn't get a job, then you would blame a person of color, because that's what the ruling class wanted people to believe. If you couldn't get a loan for a business in your own community, but somebody else could get a loan, well, whose fault? They wanted the person who couldn't get a loan to blame, the person who did get a loan. That could be another person of color. It could be, someone from Korea or someone from India. These are real materialist conditions, in this country. So it's always divide and conquer on every issue. So the main thing is that we have to continue to educate people through the struggle that the real enemy, not only of people of color, but of working people in general, is the ruling class. They want to keep us divided and fighting amongst ourselves, to divert attention away from what they're doing, on Wall Street and elsewhere. So anyway, I think that's the real lesson, that we cannot allow these struggles to be carried out in isolation. We say ultimately it's going to take really a socialist revolution, to really abolish these toxic relationships in society, where the ruling class, rules everything, including our minds, and the people on a massive scale are suffering, and mainly workers who do all the work, who provide all the wealth, but own none of it. So that really is the crux of the matter. But it doesn't mean that we don't support reforms, especially any immediate relief that people are able to get. It just needs to be done on a massive scale.